We're going to start off talking about the battle at Chickamauga. At Chickamauga, it was notable because it was dependent on railroads bringing Bragg reinforcements. Bragg is the commander for the Confederates. And so, significant about the battle at Chickamauga was that Bragg depended on the railroads to bring him reinforcements for this battle. The second day is what's important for the test. Understand that the rebels tried to surround the Union forces, but they failed at surrounding them. But even though it was a failed attempt at surrounding them, it was successful at penetrating the forces. So while they failed at being able to completely surround the Union forces, they were successful at penetrating through the forces directly. And that's what's important to realize about Chickamauga. Then for Chattanooga, we see the same thing, but on the opposite side of the war. For the Union, they were dependent on railroads bringing in reinforcements for General Grant. And then at Missionary Ridge, the Union failed to surround the Confederacy. However, this failed surrounding technique known as envelopment, even though the envelopments failed, it did turn into a successful attempt to just penetrate and go right through the forces and break through the forces, kind of like a game of Red Rover. That was successful here, where they were able to just penetrate through the forces instead of surrounding the forces completely. And this again is the battle at Chattanooga, and this was the same issue where they failed at surrounding the forces, but they were successful at penetrating through the forces. The difference between Chattanooga is that at Chattanooga, it was the Union Army that was successful, whereas at Chickamauga, it was the Confederacy that was successful. As far as how the Civil War strategy evolved over time, the Union Army went for a coordinated, continuous bunch of campaigns going on. So basically that means that Grant had planned for a bunch of campaigns taking place in different areas to all be going on at the same time, as opposed to one plan after the other. Instead of being like one single file line of plans like steps, instead he had a plan to do multiple different campaigns all at the same time, being coordinated at the same time. Alright, that's important to understand for this. It is pertaining to a test question. Then there was a hard total war to break the will. At this point, the Union was getting very aggressive. They were destroying supplies that the Confederacy needed. They were destroying any supplies in the South that could possibly aid the Confederacy. This was a technique that they called hard total war to break the will and the spirits and the morale of the South to resist. And that's what's important to realize here. The term coordinated continuous campaigns means that Grant had planned for a whole bunch of different plans and campaigns to be going on at the same time, rather than one successive plan after the other. He was having a bunch of plans all at the same time at this point. This was a hard total war to break the will and spirits of the South because they were destroying all supplies in the South that could possibly aid the Confederacy. They were destroying railroads, they were devastating resources like crops, and they were essentially trying to disrupt lines of communication and any logistical support that could give support to the Confederacy. And this technique was known as hard total war. It was kind of like a savage, brutal type of war because the Union was trying to quickly end the Civil War at this point. So check on learning. This is directly related to the test question you're going to see. They have a couple questions. Did Army tactics account for rifled muskets at all? Yes, that was from the previous PowerPoint. Remember, they did really complicated linear formations with two lines and then smaller skirmisher units at the front. What hurt the tactics' effectiveness was that in the Civil War, it was a lot of inexperienced soldiers and inexperienced commanders, and having such a large tactical strategy with so many soldiers overwhelmed all the officers, and it was also too much to expect for soldiers who hadn't had enough time to practice and drill and rehearse those types of battle tactics. The unit sizes were large. There were smaller skirmisher units at the front, and then 2 long lines, regimental lines behind them. As far as railroads and telegraphs go, it affects the operational level events. That's the campaign level again. Remember that the strategic level is the overall war, the operational level is the campaign, and the tactical level are all the battles that make up the campaigns. So, for example, the campaign actions before the first battle of Bull Run, or for operations supporting the Chattanooga area battles. So, for the Chattanooga area battles, remember railroads were important for bringing reinforcements both to the Union and Confederacy. So that's one way railroads are effective at the operational level. And same thing at the Battle of the Bull. They were dependent on railroads for bringing reinforcements and supplying reinforcements. The Anaconda Plan strategy became increasingly effective in the Civil War over time because as the war went on, the Union increased its navy size. And so they were able to get more ships out on the water to help enforce this blockade that was isolating the South and cutting it off from access to the outside world. It was effective early on, and it became more and more effective as time went on because the Union got more ships and a larger navy. And the Union Navy did implement it quickly. They implemented it right away at the beginning of the war. Later in the war, did Grant's strategic plans envision negotiations or total war? So it was total war, no negotiations, right? Grant went for the hard total war technique of having multiple campaigns all at one time and destroying lines of communications and anything that could possibly aid the Confederacy. They were trying to break the will of the Confederacy. So this was total war, and there was no room for negotiations here at this point later in the war in Grant's strategies. Respect for Southern property. There was no respect for Southern property. Grant's forces, the Union forces, were destroying all Southern property that could possibly aid the Confederacy or the South in resisting, and so they were destroying Southern property. Did his strategy require short-term sequential offensives or coordinated continuous campaigns? So it was coordinated continuous campaigns, right? It was not short-term sequential offensives, meaning it was not a bunch of small battles one after the other. It was a bunch of larger campaigns consisting of smaller battles all going on at the same time. Okay, that was how the Union changed their strategy for later on in the war. Alright, moving on. For Grant's plans in Virginia. The Overland Campaign was more or less successful, not completely successful, because they weren't able to completely destroy Lee's forces. There was a lot of battles that failed to meet Grant's primary aim, which was to completely destroy Lee's army, but they did do a really good job at crippling Lee operationally and strategically. He didn't have access to a lot of supplies anymore because they had pinned Lee down. They essentially surrounded him in Virginia and kept him isolated and stuck in one spot where he didn't have the ability to get reinforcements or supplies. So he was kind of isolated from any logistical support. He couldn't make any movements because the Union had him surrounded, and he was essentially pinned down. And at this point, even though Lee's army was still kind of in a defensive position and they were still holding off, it was only a matter of time at this point before they would essentially be extinguished. So they were running on borrowed time at this point in Virginia whenever Grant had him pinned down. Although it wasn't completely successful, again, because Grant was hoping to just go in and annihilate Lee's forces quickly and put an end to the war, but Lee was putting up a good fight, and even though he was pinned down and surrounded, he was still fighting, and he wasn't being completely wiped out. So it was not a complete success for the Union for that reason. But at this point, understand Lee was on borrowed time, basically, even though he was putting up some defensive resistance. Then for Atlanta, there was really good use of maneuvering under the Commander Sherman. This was for the Union side. The maneuver used here was turning movements in Atlanta. They succeeded in successfully turning Confederate forces and redirecting where they were going. So they emphasize this a little bit more in the notes at the bottom. What's testable here is that Sherman used maneuver via frequent turning movements to force the rebels to retreat from all their defensive positions. So the rebels were taking up defensive positions in Atlanta, and the Union was under Sherman was very successful at turning them and redirecting them to a different direction. Furthermore, in Atlanta, there was a final really large turning movement, and that's kind of what led Atlanta to fall in early September. At this point, like I said, Lee was on borrowed time, and they were focusing more on just defending themselves. And the Union went into Atlanta, and just under Sherman, they kept turning him around at every point until eventually they lost so many forces that their resistance in Atlanta fell. What was so significant about Atlanta is that there was a huge rail center there that the South had used, and as we know, railroads were essential for campaigns for bringing reinforcements and supplies, logistics, and so whenever Atlanta fell and the South lost their rail center, that was a huge blow to the Confederacy. It was a huge crippling event for the Confederacy, and that had really big political impacts for President Lincoln. It was such a big deal whenever they won Atlanta and the Confederacy lost this rail center that it was actually directly attributed to Lincoln winning his re-election because he was able to take this rail center away from the Confederacy. It also proved to the whole nation, both the North and the South, the Union's resolve. It really was a huge blow to the South's morale and their spirit of seceding from the nation. It really showed that the Union was going to win this in a matter of time. And so most of all, it really hurt the morale of the Confederacy once the rail center in Atlanta fell to the Union. And it showed that the North was not going to back down, that they were very serious about reunification. And what's most significant here is to understand that when Atlanta fell and the Union won this rail center, that was directly attributed to what helped Lincoln win his re-election. As for hard total war, Sherman eventually marched to the sea, and at Shenandoah Valley, the Union forces burned a bunch of crops because they realized that the Confederacy was living off of crops because the Shenandoah Valley was very fertile land. There was a lot of crops being grown there, and even though it's not legal to do in today's warfare, the Union was able to do it. They burned all the crops in the Shenandoah Valley, and that hurt logistical support for the Confederacy. And that's part of an example of what hard total war meant. What they mean by hard total war is it's a very brutal war tactic where they're doing everything possible to quell, to crush the Confederacy quickly and bring a quick end to the war, even by means of burning crops and doing whatever means necessary to end this war and put an end to this. Here they say destruction of any items that assisted the rebel war effort, and that was just an example, right? Burning all the crops in the Shenandoah Valley. They were destroying private property of the Southerners. They were destroying any and all assets that the Confederacy could possibly use. They were trying to really put a quick end to this. This is what they mean by hard total war. By hard total war, they also mean there was no room for negotiations. They were not going to negotiate. They just wanted to crush the Confederacy and end the war. No negotiations, no prisoners, just ending the war by all means necessary at this point. Alright, so moving on. Check on learning. For the winning side at Chickamauga, the rebels and the Missionary Ridge of the Union, did envelopments of the enemy's lines go according to plan? No, they did not. In both of these battles, the same thing happened, but on different sides. At Chickamauga, the rebels tried to surround the Union or envelop them. It didn't work. However, they were able to do the whole Red Rover thing, where they could successfully just break through their lines, and they successfully penetrated the Union's forces, and it really hurt the Union forces, and so the rebels won, even though it wasn't their exact plan. Same exact thing happened in Missionary Ridge, however, different sides. The Union tried to envelop the Confederacy, but it didn't work out that way. It's a lot harder to surround forces than it is to penetrate through them. So when they couldn't successfully surround the rebels, they instead just went for the Red Rover technique, where they just broke through and just penetrated their forces and hurt the rebels so bad that it was a success for the Union at Missionary Ridge. So penetrations became the winning maneuver. Then, did Grant's overland campaign achieve a decisive tactical win against Lee? So remember, in the overland campaign, it wasn't a decisive tactical win. They were successful, however, they just pinned Lee down. Lee was doing a good job at defending himself, so it wasn't a decisive tactical win because Grant's tactical strategy here was to completely destroy Lee's army. Remember, they were going for hard total war, and hard total war means putting an end to the war, destroying the Confederacy completely. So they failed to completely destroy the Confederacy, but they did have him pinned down, they did have him cornered in towards where he was on borrowed time, and it was only a matter of time. So operationally and strategically, like I just said, Lee was pinned down. He didn't have access to logistical support and reinforcement. So that's what happened there when it says explain. Did Sherman use frequent turning movements to take Atlanta? Yes, he did. The Confederacy took up a defensive position all throughout Atlanta, and Sherman was leading the Union forces, and he successfully kept turning them around at every corner towards where they were essentially locked in. They had nowhere to move. They couldn't maneuver around the Union. The Union basically had them corralled like cattle. Did his victory deny the South a rail center? Yes. What was so huge about the fall of Atlanta was that there was a huge rail center there. It was a nexus point of all the railroads that were bringing in reinforcements and supplies to the South. So whenever Atlanta fell, the Confederacy lost that, and it was a huge crippling blow to the Confederacy, which was what helped President Lincoln win his re-election and prove to the whole nation that the Union was taking this very seriously and that there was no chance that they would ever back down, that they were going to get the nation reunified. So it was a huge advantage to the Union morale whenever this rail center fell and they won it. In the Shenandoah Valley and the March to the Sea, did Sheridan and Sherman destroy items that assisted the rebel war effort? Yes, they did. They burned crops. They got rid of agricultural sources. They got rid of private property. They sabotaged railroads. They did everything possible to sabotage the Confederacy and crush their ability to resist because they wanted to go for hard total war and do whatever means necessary to end the war and crush the South's spirit and will to continue the war. Alright, what's really important here, it's self-explanatory. Congress, not the president, set post-war policy for the Army's role in Reconstruction. So after the Union won the Civil War, next came Reconstruction, and they had to decide how to go about helping with Reconstruction, and Congress was the one that was setting up the policies for how the Army was going to help with Reconstruction. The President was not the person who was in charge of Reconstruction. It was Congress, right? But they had a problem with force size. There were force size issues. So after the Civil War, they had a huge shrinking in the size of the Army. It went from like 1 million soldiers to about 20,000 after the Civil War was over. So with this huge problem of having a very small army, they wanted to figure out how can we get the army to occupy the South, right? For Reconstruction, they had to get the army into the South to aid with Reconstruction, make sure that the South was following the laws that were set out for them by the Union in order to bring the South back into the nation. In order to enforce that, they sent the army in there, but they had a very small army, and this led to a lot of problems because with only like 16,000 or so soldiers, about 20,000, less than 20,000, around that ballpark area. Yeah, so only 20,000 troops were sent into the South to supervise the entire South, and that's stretching themselves very thin. And so it wasn't really a practical plan to have the Army reinforce laws and enforce the laws in the South and make sure that they were doing what they were supposed to come back into the nation. So this led to some problems because the Army wasn't big enough to be able to enforce laws in the South. So they had to do something else besides have the Army completely responsible for enforcing laws in the South and bringing them back into the nation. So with this force size issue, the Army being cut drastically after the Civil War, they weren't able to cover all the South. So perseverance waned on the side of the Army. The U.S. Army had to eventually, perseverance waned over time because 20,000 troops is not nearly enough to cover all the southern states and enforce laws and make sure that the South is doing what they're supposed to in order to come back into the nation and follow the nation's laws. So they had to come up with some new ways to enforce reformation because with so little of an army presence, reformation wasn't really going very effectively. The South was still kind of doing whatever they wanted because the army wasn't big enough to really tell them what to do at this point. So they had to come up with something else that worked better. So that's what they mean by perseverance waned. Perseverance of the U.S. Army was being lost over time because with so few soldiers, how could they possibly enforce all the federal laws in the South with such a small army? And the U.S. Army kind of bit off more than they could chew, and they realized that. So there was a lot of post-Reconstruction backlash against federal Army involvement, getting involved with domestic laws, right? So it's kind of unconstitutional to have the Army out there enforcing domestic laws. And that's what led to the Posse Comitatus Act. And what's important to know about the Posse Comitatus Act is that it had a lot of loopholes. It wasn't really a very sound act. And this act basically forbid the federal army from getting involved with domestic law enforcement, right? But there was a lot of loopholes, so you could find ways around it. And there's one example that you should be familiar with that's going to be on the test. It was the Pullman strike. In the Pullman strike, a bunch of citizens were striking, and they started occupying federal highways and preventing trade systems from moving around on the highways. And at that point, it became a federal issue. So this is the loophole, right? They sent in the army to quell and get rid of this strike, but the reason they were able to do this is because of a loophole. So the U.S. Army can't get involved in domestic laws, but in this case, these strikers were occupying federal highways and preventing trade among the states, and they were preventing trade systems, which made it a federal issue. And since it was a federal issue, at this point, the federal army found a loophole, and they were able to send troops in to fight the strikers. Some of them died, some of them got killed, but because even though the Posse Comitatus Act says that the U.S. Army can't get involved with enforcing domestic laws, this was a case where there was a loophole, right? Because it got the federal government involved because the strikers were occupying federal highways and they were interfering with trade, which is a federal level issue. So that gave the federal government the authority to send in the army and fight against the strikers, and some people died. But so this is an example of a loophole where the federal government was able to get the army involved with enforcing domestic laws. Next, we move on to the Indian Wars. Most of the Indian Wars, with the exception of one being Red Cloud's War, all the other ones were about reservations. The reservations, the conditions there were not very good, and of course the Native Americans didn't want to leave their home and be forced onto reservations, so it led to a lot of backlash and a lot of fighting and wars. Now, Red Cloud's War, however, was about a different thing. In Red Cloud's War, they built this road that went through the Native Americans' territory, and the Native Americans rebelled and fought against them and actually won, and they and the U.S. government had to remove the road that they placed through these Native Americans' territory. So Red Cloud's War is the exception. All the other wars were fought because the Native Americans didn't want to go into their reservations. Red Cloud's War is the only one that's different. Red Cloud's War was because the Native Americans didn't want this United States street road going through their territory. So that's what's unique about Red Cloud's War, and that's what this slide is just telling you. That Red Cloud's War is the only one that's different. All the other Indian wars on this list were fought because the Native Americans didn't want to move onto their reservations. And we're going to go through all of these and talk about what's unique about all these wars. So Red Cloud's War, I talked to you about that. They didn't want the road going through their territory. The Modoc War, as far as the Modoc War goes, the U.S. Army struggled to eject Modocs from their lava bed defenses. There's this area where there's lava bed rocks that make up kind of like what looks like mazes. And it's kind of like it was likened to being a urban fighting territory, because there's a lot of places to hide behind. It's not really a place where you can ride horses through because the terrain is so rough, and there's lava beds, lots of rocks, very uneven terrain, and that was the Modoc War. The Native Americans, of course, didn't want to move on to the reservations, and they started hiding in these lava bed defenses that were hard to get around. It gave them a lot of cover and concealment whenever they hid behind them. And then for the Nez Perce War, the thing to know about that is they were trying to move the Nez Perce again into their reservations, but the Nez Perce didn't want to go. And the Nez Perce, these Native Americans were using guerrilla forces and guerrilla tactics, which the Army wasn't ready for because they weren't used to fighting that type of way. And as we know, that's how the Native Americans fight. They fight using guerrilla tactics. And the difficulties that formal military units like the U.S. Army have in dealing with those kind of tactics, it was really hard for them to figure out a way of how to overcome those tactics. So just know about Red Cloud's War, they wanted a road taken out of their territory. Modoc War and Nez Perce War, the Native Americans were resisting moving on to their reservations and staying there and staying put. As far as the Comanche go, fighting the Comanches took place in the South Plains. It was a lot of open territory, so the Native Americans rode horses. And what was useful in fighting in these wars was mobile units, since it's wide open terrain and the Comanche Native Americans are riding on horses and they're mounted. What was important here is that infantry wasn't as successful. In fact, they needed mobile fighting units. They needed mobile units that could move quickly because it was wide open terrain in the plains, and the Comanches were all mounted on horses and were very fast moving. As far as the Modocs go, I mentioned briefly earlier the challenge with the Modocs was that they were fighting in lava beds. There was a lot of cover and concealment, just kind of like fighting in urban areas, as the textbook describes it. Just like fighting around buildings and structures, it's a similar concept here, where the lava beds provided a lot of cover and concealment for the Native Americans, which really helps their guerrilla-style tactics, where they fight from far away and hiding behind things and move around. And so that was kind of a difficulty here. Also, with lava beds, you can't really use cavalry, because having horses trying to run through all these rough, rocky terrain isn't very effective. It's uneven terrain, very rough, rocky. So cavalry units aren't much help in the fighting the Modocs in the lava beds. Against the Apache, you want to use fast cavalry. The Apache are in the hot desert, and so they used mules to they used mules all in a line, like a train of mules, to carry troops, not horses, because horses don't do so well out in the desert, as mules are much better with the Apache, because the Apache were out in the desert. So for each one of these, they have different terrain. The Comanche are in plains, the Modoc are in lava beds, really rough, uneven, harsh terrain. The Apache are out in the desert. So different fighting techniques for each one, different tactics used for each one. For the Apache, they used mules. It's hot desert, it's rugged mountains where the Apaches fight, so you use mule trains. You don't use fast cavalry is not going to be as effective here because you're fighting in the desert in rugged terrain. The only place you really want to use cavalry is against the Comanche, where it's South Plains, because it's wide open territory out in the plains, flat, level land. Better for cavalry, better for horses running, right? Alright, so what these things have in common. Perseverance was used for the U.S. Army in all cases except Red Cloud's War. In Red Cloud's War, Perseverance wasn't really effective for the U.S. Army because the U.S. Army lost and had to give in to what the Native Americans want. Remember, it was fighting over a road that the Native Americans didn't want in their territory, and the U.S. Army didn't do too well in fighting the Native Americans in this case, and they ended up having to give the Native Americans what they wanted, which meant they had to move this road elsewhere. Continuous campaigns into winter versus resources. Okay, so in the example of the South Plains, where they were fighting the Comanches, and in the Sioux Wars, Native Americans don't like fighting in winter. They're not used to it. They don't like fighting when it's cold, when it's snowing, when it's harsh, and it's hard to find food. And the Native Americans would stockpile all their food in the summer and spring, and they would have it stored for the winter so they could ride the winter out. And the U.S. Army realized this, and they destroyed a lot of their food sources and food storage, that when winter came, they didn't have any logistical support, basically. They also weren't used to fighting in the winter, and they weren't used to using tactics in the winter. They weren't used to fighting in the cold, and so fighting them in the winter, exploiting their resources in the winter, was a very effective way that the U.S. Army found to fight against the Comanches and against the Sioux. That was in the South Plains and the Sioux Wars. Remember that fighting in the winter time was helpful in the South Plains and the Sioux Wars. Also, Indian allies. In the Apache Wars, this was really important. The U.S. Army used Indian allies in every single Indian war. Remember that. They have a test question about that, apparently. In every single Indian war they fought, they used Indian allies, which was very helpful. There were some Indians that were actually helping the U.S. Army fight against other Native Americans, and that was very helpful, and the U.S. Army used it in every single battle. One example of one that was really helpful was the Apache Scouts. There were some Apache Native Americans that were helping the U.S. Army, and they acted as scouts, and they would go and do reconnaissance missions on the Apache and bring back valuable information to the U.S. Army, and this was a crucial benefit that the U.S. Army used against the Indians in the Indian Wars. So they emphasize what's important here. It's basically everything I just said. Alright, moving on. Again, reservations often didn't end the problem. For example, for San Carlos, there was another Apache war. The Apaches didn't like living at San Carlos because the conditions were terrible at the reservations. The Native Americans wanted to move back home, and so without permission from the U.S. government, the Apaches left their reservation at San Carlos and went back home, and that was a big no-no, of course, so that led to another war where they fought against the Apaches, trying to get them to move back to San Carlos. Same concept at Pine Ridge and Wounded Knee, but at Pine Ridge and Wounded Knee, it's known as being it was a much more brutal fight at Wounded Knee. But same essential concept. At Pine Ridge, The conditions at the reservations at Pine Ridge were deplorable. The Native Americans didn't want to live there, and so they left the reservation and they tried to go back home, and they didn't want to stay on the reservation, and then the U.S. Army had to fight against them, trying to get them to move back to their reservation. That was what San Carlos and Pine Ridge were about. So this example here is just showing how reservations don't always end the problem. Once you move the Native Americans to the reservation, then you have a whole second issue, right? How to keep the Native Americans on the reservation, because the Native Americans did not want to stay on the reservations, and they often protested violently and led to these violent conflicts between the U.S. Army and the Native Americans that would not stay put. This is a grid that kind of summarizes everything that we talked about. The ones in red are the ones that would be tested. So what to know here? Was there a reservation aim? There was a reservation aim for every single Indian war except for the Red Cloud War. Remember, the Red Cloud War was fighting over a road, and that's why it's unique. Was there early tactical issues? Yes. There's almost always early tactical issues, except from the South Plains, because that's easy terrain, right? It's flat, it's open, you can use cavalry, there's no real struggle there. But for all the other battles, there were tactical issues because they're fighting against guerrilla tactics, which they're not used to, and usually the terrain makes it hard to do things like cavalry or mounted units of some kind. Also, Perseverance was no, only for Red Cloud, because Red Cloud is the one battle where the U.S. Army lost and had to give in. So that's the only one where there was no perseverance. So that's what's unique about Red Cloud, was that there was no reservation issue involved, and there was no perseverance on the side of the U.S. Army, because the U.S. Army lost that battle, right? For the South Plains, yes, the U.S. Army showed perseverance because they won in the South Plains against the Comanches, and they used the advantage of having campaigns go into the winter, which the Comanches in the South Plains were not used to. They didn't like fighting in the winter, and they stored all their food over the winter that they harvested from the spring and summer, and the U.S. Army exploited that by destroying their food resources and food storages, so they had no logistical support. As far as the Modocs go, remember this was fought in lava beds. Okay, the Modocs were fought in lava beds, and that led to tactical issues, because it's just like fighting in urban areas. There's a lot of cover and concealment. Also, you can't really use cavalry units here, and it's hard to use mobile units because of all the rocky, uneven, rough terrain that you have to move through. As far as the Sioux go, the Sioux and the South Plains both start with S's. They have something in common. They were both fought in the winter, because like I said, Native Americans don't like fighting in the winter. That's what the South Plains battles and the Sioux Wars have in common. They were both fought in the winter. That's how the U.S. Army won them, because Native Americans don't like fighting in the winter. They're not prepared for it. As far as Nez Perce goes, everything is self-explanatory there. They had early tactical issues. They almost always had early tactical issues. For the test's sake, everything will be tested on. There were always early tactical issues when they were fighting against the Native Americans, because they weren't used to guerrilla tactics, and the terrain was often very difficult. The Apaches were fought in the desert. And the huge benefit here for the U.S. Army was the use of Indian allies. Of course, the U.S. Army always used Indian allies. Every single time they ever fought the Indians, they always used Indian allies. However, for the Apaches, it was significantly helpful. The Apache scouts were a huge, huge success for the U.S. Army, especially against the Apaches. That's why they have yes highlighted here. And of course, it was a reservation issue. It was always a reservation issue, except for Red Cloud. Okay? So that's kind of what's the overall important things to know about each of these 6 Indian wars. Alright, now for the check on learning. For the U.S. Army, did the South Plains, Modoc, and Apache Wars each present a different environmental and tactical challenge? Yes, they did. The South Plains were wide open, so you could use cavalry, you could use mobile units pretty easily out there. For Modoc, they were fought in lava beds, so rocky, uneven, rough terrain. You can't really use cavalry for that. You can't get horses through it. It also helped the Native Americans with their guerrilla tactics because they had a lot of cover and concealment to hide behind. As far as the Apache Wars goes, it was fought in the desert, and it's harder to fight in the desert because cavalry units aren't as effective there because it's mountainous, rough, hot, brutal terrain, but they did find it was effective to use mule trains. You can use mules to carry reinforcements, to carry supplies, for logistical support. You can use mules because mules are better suited to rough, hot, brutal terrain like in the desert. So in the Apache Wars, they had to use mules. So each had a very different environmental challenge that they had to use different types of tactics for. Did the Army use campaigns into winter to win the South Plains and Sioux Wars? Yes. Remember, the South Plains and Sioux Wars have one very important thing in common. Both of them were fought during the winter because that gave the U.S. Army a huge advantage because Native Americans didn't like fighting during the winter. And the U.S. Army could exploit them by destroying their food storage that they had stored throughout the summer and spring to get them through the winter. And so they had poor logistical support, and they also just didn't like fighting in the winter. Did the U.S. Army avoid using Indian allies in the Apache Wars because they were always unreliable? Absolutely not. So the U.S. Army always used Indian allies. Always. For every single battle against the Indians, there were always some Indians that were helping the U.S. Army. This was especially true in the Apache Wars. The Apache Scouts were a huge success in taking down the Apaches. In Red Cloud, Nez Perce, and Modoc Wars, the Army applied perseverance and good tactics consistently to send all of these Indians to reservations. No, remember, in Red Cloud was fought because they didn't want a road going through their land. The Native Americans fought the U.S. Army. The U.S. Army didn't do so well, and they had to give in to the demands of the Native Americans. That wasn't about reservations. And good tactics weren't always used consistently, right? A lot of times they had issues with tactics because they were fighting against guerrilla tactics, which was a new challenge for the U.S. Army that they weren't used to from the Civil War and other battles like that. They were used to linear tactics, but now they're having to battle against guerrilla tactics, so they're having to adapt their tactics. Also, they're fighting in Modoc, they were fighting in lava beds, which is really rough terrain to fight in, and so tactics kind of were a little messy, especially at Red Cloud, obviously, because they lost and had to give in to the Native Americans. But Red Cloud wasn't even about a reservation, right? Then, were the San Carlos and Pine Ridge reservations examples of how Indians remained pacified after the Army sent them to such places? Absolutely not, right? San Carlos and Pine Ridge were terrible reservations. The Native Americans didn't want to stay there, so they would escape. They would go back home without the U.S. Army's permission, and then it led to very violent wars and battles where the U.S. Army had to try to force them to go back where they belonged, back on the reservations. And so moving Native Americans to reservations is not the end of the situation. It brings up a whole new problem, a whole new series of problems. So Indians do not remain pacified. Alright, that's what's important to know for what we've gone over so far. Alright, next. Competing reform views. Upton versus Logan. This is pretty straightforward. Emory Upton and John Logan were two people who had different ideas on how to reform the U.S. Army during these tough times after the Indian Wars and after they were still repairing everything from the Civil War. Emory Upton's views was that they had to be stronger, more regular Army units. He really emphasized the importance of having West Point graduates be officers, so he was all about big Army, regulars, being the backbone of the U.S. Army, whereas John Logan was more like George Washington. He believed that the backbone of the U.S. military should be large, well-trained militia or volunteer forces, and he had less emphasis on regular Army, big Army, and West Point officers. He believed that what should be the emphasis of the U.S. Army should be well-trained militia and volunteers. That's John Logan for militia and Emory Upton for big Army regulars and West Point. This event led to what was the National Guard Association. It was a way to improve militia standards, and they pushed for more federal congressional funding instead of less. So the National Guard Association was all about improving on militia, and they really wanted more involvement from the federal government. They wanted more federal government support for the militias, and basically having the federal government make the militias be a more legitimate part of the U.S. military. That was the National Guard Association and what they were all about, getting the federal government and congressional funding to be more involved and be a more integral part of militias. Alright, now check on learning. Did the president dominate post-Civil War construction policy, or did Congress? It was Congress. The president did not dominate post-Civil War Reconstruction policy. It was all Congress, right? Did the U.S. expand its army size to persevere in providing full security and lasting reform in the South? No, they did the opposite. The U.S. reduced its army size, and they were unable to persevere in the South. And they could not provide full security because the U.S. Army was so small. And they had to kind of give up on having the federal government army enforce reformation in the South, and they had to give up. So there was no perseverance because the army was so small that they had to eventually come up with an act saying that the federal army could not get involved with enforcing civil law. Did a post-Reconstruction backlash against the federal U.S. Army role in domestic law enforcement produce an airtight law banning same? No, it did not. The law was not airtight. The act had loopholes. There were big loopholes in the act, as evidenced by the Pullman rail strike. Remember, all these citizens were on strike. They were occupying federal highways and preventing trade from being conducted among states, and that led to a federal issue. At the point that this strike became a federal issue, then the federal government was able to send army troops in and quell the strike. So here we see the federal army is using their troops to enforce law for law enforcement. However, this is a loophole where this is still allowed because it became a federal problem because they were occupying federal highways and they were preventing trade from taking place. So this is an example of a loophole where the federal government can still, in some cases, use the U.S. Army to enforce domestic laws. Did Emory Upton and John Logan both want Army reform? Yes, they did. However, they had opposite ideas on what to do. Emory Upton was all about being pro-regular forces. He was all about West Point graduates being officers, whereas John Logan believed in militia forces. He was all about the militia, just like George Washington. He thought that the militia should be the backbone of the U.S. Army. Was the National Guard Association formed to preserve local militia units as they were, or to improve them? The National Guard Association was all about improving local militias because they wanted to get congressional involvement a bigger thing. They wanted to get the federal Congress more involved with militias. They wanted the federal Congress to give more funding to militias and provide more for training, provide more logistical support for militias. So the National Guard Association was all about being pro-federal Congress's involvement in the militias and getting them to help the militias. Alright, next, the Spanish-American War. The Army was neglected. They rapidly started recruiting people for the Army because, like I said, after the Civil War, the Army was very small. So now they start rapidly recruiting more and more Army, expanding the Army. However, that leads to a problem. Whenever you quickly start recruiting a bunch of people into the Army, you have logistical problems. There's really big problems with support. How do you feed all these people? There's reports in the history in the textbook about them using rotten food, them not having enough medical supplies. They didn't even have enough clothes for all the army soldiers, or boots, or shoes. They didn't have any supplies for their army. They didn't have good food, no medical supplies. And so a big army doesn't always necessarily mean a better army. They were rapidly expanding the army, but they didn't have enough support to kind of maintain a good army. And that was kind of the problem at the start of the Spanish-American War. The Navy was doing great. They invested a lot in supporting the Navy. So the Navy was really good, but the Army was really suffering at the beginning of the Spanish-American War. And we'll see the effects of that in some of these battles. So, right off the bat, beginning of the war, the Navy secured Manila Bay in the Philippines quickly. It was a really easy battle. Right away, right off the bat, the Navy instantly secured the Philippines. But there was a problem. They didn't have a good army. And so, literally, the Navy commander won this battle, and then he had to wait like 3 months just sitting there, literally, in the water, waiting for army support to come and hold down the land at Manila Bay. Because the Navy was really like, they jumped the gun. They knew they had the power to do this really quickly. It was a really short battle, really simple, very, very, very low casualties. The U.S. Navy took this so quickly, right at the beginning, but it was so early in the war that the Army wasn't even ready, and it took 3 months for them to even gather up enough Army troops to then land troops on land and then hold Manila Bay after the Navy secured it. That's what's important to know about this Navy securing of the Philippines. Alright? And then, moving on to the South Cuba campaign. It's known for having bad logistics. There was only one roadway into Florida Panhandle where they were leaving to go into South Cuba. And there was a huge traffic jam that went all the way to the Carolinas because they couldn't get all the supplies to Cuba where they needed to go through Florida. And so they had a really hard time loading up the ships with all the crates, and even when the crates were loaded, there was no labels on the crates. They didn't know what crates were what supplies, and then they even had not even enough people to unload the crates once they got to Cuba. So, terrible logistical support getting supplies where they needed to go. It was very slow. It was also very clumsy, this logistical support for South Cuba. That's what's important to know about the South Cuba campaign. Also, there was weak staff work, like I said. They didn't even have enough people to unload the crates and all the supplies. They also didn't have enough people to bring ammunition and weapons. There was also a problem with diseases like typhoid, yellow fever, malaria. Fighting in this tropical region, there's a lot of insect-borne diseases. Yellow fever, malaria, typhoid, and that was a huge issue to the U.S. Army in this case. A lot of people were dying, not even from the war, just from the diseases in the area. So for the third bullet, what's testable? This deserves some emphasis here. Examples of poor coordination that they're talking about and poor staff work. Some specific examples were the clumsy use of an observation balloon, and also misplaced artillery, like I said, using arms and ammunition. They didn't have the right people to move the arms and ammunition to where they needed to be. So that was poor staff work, which is understandable in certain ways because the Army hadn't conducted these types of huge operations since the Civil War. And so they didn't really know what they were doing. They didn't have kind of experience doing campaigns of this magnitude, and that led to a logistical catastrophe. And also to exacerbate things, fighting in this tropical region, they had huge problem with diseases. Alright, then in the Philippines, we talked about the early naval battle that secured Manila Bay, but then they had to wait about 3 months for ground troops to be accumulated and sent to then hold the bay down. The Navy was blockading the area, so that way they couldn't get reinforcements in, and so the U.S. Navy pretty much secured the land, but they couldn't actually get boots on the ground for 3 months because the Army was so small and had such a problem with everything at this point. the U.S. rebel tensions, the staged Battle of Manila. So this is like the weirdest battle so far in U.S. history that we talked about. The staged Battle of Manila. So the United States didn't want the rebels in the Philippines to take down the Spanish and take over the area. However, the U.S. Army was also not wanting Spain to keep control of the Philippines. So they were kind of like in a complicated situation where their enemy, the U.S. and the rebels in the Philippines, had a common enemy. It was Spain, right? However, for one moment in the fighting, the U.S. Army and Spain saw eye to eye on something. Both of them didn't want the rebels to take down the Philippines and take down Spain because it would look bad for both the U.S. and Spain. So Spain agreed to put up a small fight, kind of like throw the fight against the U.S., and they staged a fight that wasn't really a real fight. The U.S. and the Spanish did, and of course the U.S. won because the Spanish agreed to not put up much of a fight in this staged battle. That's why staged is in quotations here, because it was like a staged battle where the Spanish said they weren't really going to fight, but they would fake that they were fighting. And the U.S. Army, of course, won this staged battle, and then the rebels, they gave up. The rebels gave up their cause because the rebels realized that the U.S. was going to be taking the Philippines for themselves now, which is what the rebels didn't want. But after seeing the U.S. beat the Spanish so easily in this staged fight, the rebels realized there was really no cause in fighting against the U.S. anymore. And so then Spain left, and they agreed to a treaty with the U.S., where now the U.S. gained the Philippines as part of their territory. And that was the staged Battle of Manila. A really weird battle. If you want, you can read about it in page 360. It explains how it was a staged battle, how the Spanish faked fighting, and really quickly the U.S. Army won the battle, as was planned beforehand, just to intimidate the rebels and get the rebels to give up, and then everybody kind of got what they wanted. Except for the rebels, I guess, who gave up. So U.S. and Spain got what they wanted. Alright, so now, for Check on Learning. Was the U.S. Army well prepared for the Spanish-American War? Their Navy was, but the Army was not. They rapidly recruited a bunch of people into their Army, but they didn't have all the supplies to maintain such a large Army. How well did its South Cuba logistical operations go, staff work, and disease control go? All three were a catastrophe. There was terrible logistical operations in South Cuba. The staff work did a terrible job with placing artillery where it needed to be. They did a terrible job with getting the supplies distributed, and they had a huge problem with disease because it was in this tropical region where they had a problem with yellow fever, dengue, typhoid fever. Diseases were just kicking the U.S. Army's ass here. Then in the Philippines, the U.S. Navy secured Manila Bay very quickly, right out the bat, like very first thing, so quickly, like the war barely even started. And the U.S. Navy went in there and they took Manila Bay, set up a blockade, but they had to wait like 3 months for the U.S. Army to come in and then put boots on the ground and secure Manila Bay. Then it's asked, did the U.S. Army then work well with Filipino rebels to take Manila? Did Manila's conquest require a hard fight? No, Manila fell very easily because the U.S. and Spain did this kind of fake fight where the U.S. was prearranged to win, and then the rebels gave up. So did the U.S. Army then work well with Filipino rebels to take Manila? Let's see, let's talk about this so it's better to understand. The staged fight at Manila, what they want you to know specifically about it. So, originally, when they arrived in the Philippines, the U.S. relations with the rebels were not good because the rebels suspected the U.S. wanted to become the Philippines' new colonial master, and the rebels wanted to be independent. They didn't want a colonial master, but they could kind of see the writing on the wall, and the rebels could see that the U.S. wanted to own the Philippines. So right off the bat, the rebels didn't like the United States. Furthermore, the U.S. and the Spanish both had something in common, even though they were enemies at the time. These enemies, being the U.S. and the Spanish, had a similar anxiety. Both the U.S. and the Spanish did not want the rebels to succeed against the Spanish. They didn't want the rebels to fight the Spanish and win. Both of them didn't want that because that'd be an embarrassment for both the U.S. and the Spanish if the rebels won against the Spanish. So the Americans made a deal with the Spanish where the Spanish would put up a light fight against the U.S. The U.S. would win this prearranged, easy fight, and then they would take the Philippines. The rebels weren't even involved in the fight, but after the U.S. won against the Spanish, then the rebels kind of gave up, and the United States bought the Philippines from Spain and they owned the Philippines after this fight, after this staged battle at Manila.